there. I am Pauletta Hansel again with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition's Story Gathering Project. And I am very pleased today to be interviewing one of my dear friends and a wonderful urban Appalachian woman, Elissa Yancey. Welcome, Elissa.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I am so glad you're here. Well, as you know, I have some questions for you for the Story Gathering Project. And the first one, if you wouldn't mind saying your name and where you're living now.
Sure. So my name is Elissa Yancey, and I currently live in Northside, a neighborhood in Cincinnati, where I have lived since 1994.
Wow. Yeah, I think probably as long as we've known each other. Is that right?
I believe that is true.
Yeah, Alyssa and I were once neighbors in Northside, as well as colleagues at the Urban Appalachian Council. But I never knew your middle name was Lee. So
I just wanted to toss that in there. It's got a good ring to it. Elissa.
In these interviews, we always learn something.
Right.
So, Elissa, can you tell us where and approximately when, you don't need to be exact if you don't want to, you were born, and where you grew up, and maybe just a little bit about what your life and your family was like as you were growing up?
Sure. So I am the youngest of 6 children. I was born and raised in one house in Norwood, Ohio. It was the second house in Norwood that my parents had owned. My mom was 42 when she had me, and I will just be right out there and say I was born in 1965. And really, when in Norwood, we were part of a community where lots of the folks around us were employed by or somehow connected to the General Motors plant for Trans Ams, which was the big industry in the city all throughout my growing up years. And actually it made Norwood, which is a city completely surrounded by the city of Cincinnati, pretty strong financially and pretty strong independently, because that was a good, just a good economic boost for the city. And a lot of the classmates I had growing up had family who worked at the plant, and family in Kentucky and Southern Kentucky, where they went regularly. So it was a pretty hotbed of urban Appalachian activity, although I didn't identify it as that at the time at all.
Right. So what was it, what was it like for you? Did you go to school in Norwood? Did you live in a house with a yard, or were you in an apartment, or sort of what? Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I loved the house I grew up in. It was a 2-family that had been converted back to a 1-family when we moved in, because there were 6 kids, and my mom was pregnant with me when we moved there. So they had 5 kids in a much smaller home. And my oldest siblings were just heading off to college when I was born. So yeah, it was a house. We had a great yard. We had a giant tree in the backyard that we always loved. And I remember when I was little, my mom, my family comes in like 2 chunks. There's a boy and a girl, and a girl and a boy and a girl, and then an 8-year gap, and then a girl and a boy, and then a 5-year gap, and then me. So we had almost like 3 different family sets kind of growing up in these different eras. And when I was young, only the 3 youngest were really still actively at home all the time. And my mom, we got Coney Island swimming passes. So we went to Coney Island Sunlight Pool. And I remember one summer we would go pretty much every day, because it was a way to get us all out of the house. And our tree got hit by lightning while we were gone. So when we came home, it was really scary. So that was my big, we always had our sunlight pool. And then after the tree had to be cut down, we had an above ground pool put in. It was just like, and then we never left the house. We had a big garage. We played like wiffle ball in the backyard. I remember roller skating in the backyard. I remember I loved watching musicals on the old like Channel 19, and anytime it rained, I would put on a raincoat and my little rain boots and go out with my umbrella and perform singing in the rain.
I can see you doing that now.
There was no one there to watch me, but I just felt compelled to go out and just perform to the world. So yeah, and the elementary school I went to was about a block away.
Which one was it?
It was Williams Avenue.
Okay.
So we lived on Ellesmere, and so we were literally like a block and not even a half. So when I got older, I would walk home from school with my friends. But my mom grew up in Letcher County, Kentucky, and she only got to learn to drive after she'd had 3 kids. So she loved to drive. So she would drive me that block to school every morning. And often through my earlier years in elementary school, she would drive and pick me up for lunch and drive me home and drive me back and then come and get me. She loved to drive.
Yes. Do you think she took a side trip so that it took a little bit longer?
Well, she may have gone places after she dropped me off, but it was always like we just were like a half a minute ride home.
So when did you learn to walk?
Right. Yeah, I really was.
I was 15 before I went.
It was and the other thing is I was a kindergarten dropout because I had, excuse me, I had asthma as a kid, and my mom had asthma, and her mom actually died when my mom was 14 of pneumonia. And she had 13 kids that survived. Anyway, so I had asthma as a little kid. And when I went to kindergarten, I had a teacher who really kind of was not very kind to me when I would be absent because I would have asthma, and my mom would keep me home. So by the time that I wasn't in kindergarten for long before she said something to me like, well, if you're going to be absent, you're never going to be able to be anything. You can't, you're never going to be successful. So, you really need to come to school all the time. And my mom marched up. I don't even think she drove. I think she walked up to the school.
Right,
had a little conversation with the teacher and then with the principal, and I was dropped out of kindergarten pretty quickly before Thanksgiving that year. And then I went back to first grade the next year because it was like, then when I was valedictorian of my high school, one of my dreams was to go back and say, oh, so I'm not going to amount to anything, huh?
Showed you.
I showed her, man.
So you mentioned your mom's family is from Letcher County. Let's talk about that. I don't know where your dad's family was from, so you can tell us that. But sort of what you knew, what you heard about your families growing up, and what connections you might have had to those places.
Yeah, so it's interesting because my mom talked nearly every day to one of her sisters, my Aunt Gertrude, who lived and had moved up and stayed in, it's not Anderson, in the Beachmont area, like Anderson Township, Amelia. I think it was more Amelia where she was. And so the first notion that I had that we were anything other than just all Norwood all the time, no accents or anything, was hearing my mom talk to my Aunt Gertrude over the phone, or my mom, who didn't really have much of an accent, within seconds of talking to Aunt Gertrude would be like talking, I'd be like, who are you? What are you talking about? Like, why are you talking that way? And she'd be talking about all these cousins and nieces and nephews. And so she had sisters who were Gertrude, Bertha, Georgia, Mildred, Opal. I mean, they had all of them.
And what was your mom's name?
Gladys. My mom's name was Gladys. Yes. Yeah. And so she was the baby of her family too. So my Aunt Gertrude really was out of the house when my mom was growing up. So she already had a family of her own. And my mom would tell me stories about my Aunt Gertrude's daughters who were singers, and they were the Sunshine Sisters. So they had these stage names, Minnie, Maddie, and Martha. And Minnie and Maddie and Martha started off on the church route down in church. They traveled around and sang in different churches down in Letcher County. My mom was actually born and raised in Holler in Neon, Kentucky. So, which is right outside of Whitesburg, the county seat, which I didn't even go to until I was in my late 20s.
Yeah. And by then it was Fleming Neon.
By then it was Fleming Neon, absolutely. Right. And then, yeah, so my mom would tell me stories about the Sunshine Sisters and Minnie, Maddie, and Martha, although those weren't their names, and how they had left home pretty early for that era. So that had to have been like the 40s or early 50s to have a radio show. And that, then two of them went on to have careers in singing and songwriting, and the other one married a postal worker and just was the wife of a postal worker. So I knew that little bit, but I was mortified when I would hear my mom talk with that accent. And actually my dad, who I have found out, like he graduated from Norwood High School. So I grew up in Norwood. He graduated from Norwood High School. So I kind of had always thought, well, he's just always been there. Well, that wasn't the case. He was in World War II. And then when he came back, and my mom traveled around to different bases while he was in basic training and such, but they lived in Northern Kentucky and that's where my mom learned to drive on back roads in Northern Kentucky. And eventually, I think they had the 3 first kids when they moved back to Norwood. So my dad, though, was born and raised near Louisville, Kentucky. So and I only ever knew his stepfather because his mother had passed away before I was born. Both of my mom's parents had passed away long before I was born. And I know that my grandmother, my dad's mom, is buried in a cemetery by the old St. Mark's Church in Evanston. And then I didn't know until looking up ancestry.com the history of my dad's family, because I was like, well, what happened to my dad's dad? And I had thought that because I'd been told that my grandma had divorced him. It turned out he died when he was 34 years old of cirrhosis of the liver. And so I found that out just this past year. And then so that's really got me thinking about that whole branch of the family and things that happened there that I'd never even heard, because my dad was an only child.
Right.
And then my step granddad, Tex, was from, Texas? I don't know where he was from, Texas. He was from Texas. And he had a bunch of sisters, but he was from Louisville. So they moved here. So I'm guessing, and so, yeah, my dad was 5 or 6 when his dad died. So they moved up to Norwood, and I don't know, I have no idea why, unless it was because that's where Tex got work or whatever. My dad was he didn't share stories about growing up.
Yeah.
And, but my mom would, when pressed, and often like for school projects, I would have to ask, or I would ask her sort of like dig a little bit deeper. But so all I knew was that my mom really was close with her mom. And it was really devastating for her when her mom died. She was a young teenager. And from what I've been able to tell now, my mom used to say that her dad was a womanizer. So, what does that mean, right? And so then you go back into Ancestry, and you can see there are different children he had like 14 with Carrie Ventures, who was my grandma, but he also had maybe some other children too. He got married a couple more times before my mom moved up at the age of 18 to Norwood.
Okay. So this question is maybe a little too complex, but I'm just, I'm interested because you said that you didn't think of yourself as Appalachian, and you grew up among what you now know are other urban Appalachian families, and yet when your mom started talking country, you were embarrassed. And so I just wonder if you have any sense of why that embarrassed you, because it sounds like you weren't really exposed a lot to Appalachian stereotypes since you were among Appalachian people.
Only in media, but I think the media
Okay.
stereotypes were really strong. I mean, we watched Hee Haw,
Oh, okay.
right?
Yeah.
Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved Petticoat Junction.
Yeah.
Green Acres, though. I mean, like that was the era that I grew up in. I was a total TV kid, right? Always that, and I think there was just this sense that if you had an accent, it meant that you weren't speaking proper English.
Yeah.
And that was just, and I don't know. And certainly it was media up to a point, and then I kind of had that. It was mixed because I was both kind of like ashamed, like, don't talk like that. Certainly don't talk like that around my friends, right? Sort of intrigued. And then there was, then I think there were a couple of turns. One was when I graduated from high school, and I was a guest at a breakfast with my mother and father at Xavier University, where it was an honors breakfast, and I was talking to one of the professors from the English department, because I was going to be an English major. And that professor said, when he asked what high school I went to, and I said Norwood, which is of course right up the street from Xavier University. And we lived, seriously, I could have easily walked to Xavier University from our house because we were in that part of Norwood. And he said something along the lines of, oh, well, what percentage of your classmates are going to go on to college? Like 20%. And that's when, now looking back, I realized I was angry at the moment. I was mortified because I felt like he was disrespecting my parents and disrespecting me. I determined in that second I would never go to that school. And I'm like, oh, that was my like total pride. That was just like, wait, what? I can say whatever I want, but you, sir, you may not, right? You need to stop talking like that about the people I've grown up with, because I knew they were hardworking, and I knew they were smart, and I knew there was we had so many AP classes. I mean, our school was enriched by having this like automobile plant right in our backyard, and we also had US playing cards. It was like a very booming industrial city. So for someone to be so ignorant about that really ruffled my feathers. And I think it showed me, I think for the first time, that how much your address could influence what people thought of you, even if they didn't know you.
Yeah.
And that really carries with me to this day.
Yeah.
And then the other turning point, I think, a turning point for me when I was in my kind of still formative years was in my last year. I ended up going to the University of Cincinnati. I didn't want to leave my mom. I mean, that's just basically it. We were very close, and I could have gone away to school. None of my siblings went away to school. That's true. And, but I just wanted to stay here. So I ended up being the editor of the student newspaper at the University of Cincinnati. And I remember in 1988, General Motors shut down. And I remember writing an editorial about that and sort of what it meant to the people of my city. Right. And that it was this big deal. And I mean, now when you think of Norwood, you think of, Brookwood the Rookwood Pavilion, all the upscale, or middle upscale retail and dining and entertainment. But I mean, there was a long stretch when it was really hard, and a lot of people lost a lot in that era. And that also really, I think, struck me as sort of a slap in the face to all the people who had worked so hard and who had been so proud of the work that they did. And then sort of like, all right, now what do you do? Now it's on you to solve the problems that other people have created for you. So, yeah.
Yeah. So when did you start to kind of turn that sense of awareness of your Norwoodian background and how people were, were saw you and viewed you versus how intimately you knew the community? When and how did you turn that into an awareness of an urban Appalachian background?
I will say that, as I look back on it, it's like it was right there in front of me all along, obviously. But then I went away to graduate school. I came back, I was teaching, and it was before I had, I think it was still before I had my, oh yeah, it was definitely before I had my first child. But I worked at Cincinnati Bell, and my boss there is a woman named Nancy Jones,
Mhm.
who was a board member of the Urban Appalachian Council.
Mm.
And so she was my boss, and she knew I grew up in Norwood, and she said, you should come along with me and to a meeting at UAC. And that's when I met Maureen Sullivan. I met you. I met Mike Henson. I met all the folks there. And all of a sudden, I started to learn. And my eyes were, I guess it's like somebody said this to me the other day, when the student is ready, the teacher will come.
Mhm.
Right. And that's sort of where I was in the right space in my life, where I wasn't too defensive or too influenced by media sources to understand the values that were really important, that I had come by very honestly, and then started to appreciate that, and then say, oh my gosh, that's why it was so important for my mom to stay connected to her sister in that way. That's why they always talked about, all of the different relatives who were maybe still in different phases, whether they were in Nashville or still in Letcher County or in Florida or Georgia or wherever they had gone. And then I started to gain an awareness of the people who were like me, but not in the same neighborhoods I had been in, and just really grew to love them.
Yeah. So I know the answer to this question, I do believe, but and I think you're hinting at it here, but I wonder if you would tell us about what you're doing now, because I can really see the threads of your work in the young Elissa.
It's interesting, right? Yeah. So I now have a nonprofit called A Picture's Worth, and it's really focused on narrative change, really how the stories that we share create the realities in which we live, and how for so long the stories that we share have been very narrow and limited by people in power, and people in power, that power is more not necessarily the power within, but the power of structures that have been created to keep certain people at different levels of society. And I think that the more we allow people who are, everyone, to create their own story, to basically share their own value as opposed to have it interpreted by other folks. Because the interesting thing that I've seen, so that I went into a life in journalism, I went into a life in education, and became struck over and over again by the harm that people coming in to speak with people who they think they understand, but they don't, can really do damage, and not just damage interpersonally, but damage in a community, damage in a city, damage in a country, damage in a world, that then limits our ability to really appreciate the depth and breadth of our values, of our shared values, as well as our diversity.
And where can people find out more about your work?
Oh, so you can go to the website, apicturesworth.org.
Okay.
You can listen to A Picture's Worth podcasts on anywhere you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Instagram, which is a great place to catch up with some of our episodes, where we're really highlighting what people value, what people's strengths are. And that's our Instagram handle is apicturesworth.org. And yeah, I think our goal is really to continue to share these kinds of narratives that will upend some stereotypes and allow for deeper understanding and connection.
That's great. Well, Elissa, thank you so much. I know we're coming to the end of our time, but is there anything that you'd like to tell me that I haven't given you the opportunity to?
I will just say that as the youngest child of a youngest child, the thing that I am most proud of being able to do now is do the kind of work that my mom was doing in her own community, but doing it in a bigger community, and opportunities she did not get in terms of going to college, in terms of getting different kind of platforms available to her. What's so interesting, so I want to share one more story.
Mm-hmm.
One of my other early memories is my mom sitting with a reel-to-reel tape recorder in our kitchen, in our tiny little kitchen table, with our old neighbors and recording them telling their stories.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I
Do you
think
still have that?
No, I wish, no, and I would give
You have it in
anything
here.
if I had those stories, because they were old. They were an old country brother and sister, neither of whom ever married. And, that is just I think that has been a part of me through her. And I'm just so proud to be able to carry it forward.
Well, I'm so glad that you do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elissa. This has been lovely. I am Pauletta Hansel with the Urban Appalachian Community Coalition Story Gathering Project, talking to Elissa Yancey, Urban Appalachian extraordinaire and founder and director of A Picture's Worth. Thanks so much.
Thank you.